Hello, and welcome to The Power of Education, Building Foundations for Future Success. My name is Sarah Ahrens, and I'm a partnership specialist with the Public and Private Partnerships Department of Huntington Learning Center, where I have worked on and off since 2003. I work with a team that focuses on assisting our centers in building relationships with schools, organizations, and agencies to support and provide publicly funded programs. This opportunity Huntington provides allows our almost 50 years of experience to help more students improve their academic skills, confidence, and motivation to achieve success in school. The title of this workshop, Power of Education, Building Foundations for Future Success, says it all. We began our partnership with the National Partnership for Juvenile Services this year and learned not only about the youth in care and the academic needs they have, but also how we can work together to provide them with the crucial educational support they need to ultimately lead successful lives. I'm here today to familiarize you with the reciprocal relationship between unmet educational needs and juvenile justice system involvement. I will also share ways in which supplemental educational support can address academic deficiencies and lead youth and their families to better outcomes. Finally, I hope you leave this workshop able to identify the advantages of providing instructional intervention at all points along the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention's continuum of care, and how academic remediation will benefit the youth, their families, and communities in which they reside. Just like everyone involved with juvenile justice services, we are a mission-driven company. Our goal is to give every student the best education possible. The word every is underlined because we support all students from all walks of life. And for nearly 50 years, we have provided students with rehabilitation through individualized educational support. According to the Youth and Juvenile Justice System National Report by the OJJDP, NIJ, and NCJJ, the juvenile justice system was founded on the concepts of rehabilitation through individualized justice. So together, we both share the mission of rehabilitation through individualized support and interventions. The focus of our workshop today is on this bidirectional relationship between academic adversity and juvenile justice system involvement. This relationship is complex and bidirectional, with a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable groups. The intersection of risk factors such as poverty, family instability, and community violence also contributes to both academic struggles and justice involvement. Despite these vulnerabilities, justice-involved youth are unfortunately among the most educationally underserved, facing frequent school changes, inappropriate placements, lost instructional time, uncertified teachers, subpar curriculum, and limited access to advanced coursework. Their academic records are often disjointed and hard to obtain in a timely manner, with credits that do not transfer, leading to higher dropout rates. Additionally, detained youth often lose constructive social bonds that reinforce positive behavior and norms, which could be a protective factor to reduce delinquency and recidivism. Conversely, frequent moves, stigmatization, and association with high-risk peers increase academic and behavioral issues, raising the likelihood of school dropout, system involvement, and recidivism. Youth entering the system often exhibit lower academic achievement, with many performing well below grade level, often not exceeding elementary standards. Upwards of 70% of juvenile offenders have learning disabilities, and they are 7 times more likely than students in public school settings to require special education services. Despite these high percentages, many impacted youth receive inadequate academic support or remediation, contributing to poor outcomes. There is often not a strong enough connection between individualized student needs and prevention, diversion, or treatment interventions. And again, the individualization is the mission that we both at Huntington and in the juvenile justice system feel is what is necessary to help these youth be successful. The good news is that adolescence is marked by neuroplasticity, offering opportunities for rehabilitation when youth receives early and effective interventions. Such intercessions must address both educational deficiencies, behavioral issues, and inadequate juvenile justice practices to prevent youth from becoming trapped in a cycle of disadvantage. To reduce recidivism and improve student, family, and community outcomes, local and state governments should hold juvenile schools accountable for providing equal access to education and vocational programs which are accredited and employ evidence-based curricula and methods. And so, as you can see, there is a significant correlation between punitive school discipline policies, unaddressed academic needs, disabilities, and behavioral issues, as well as dropouts and poor performance that create this bidirectional relationship between the adversity and the justice system involvement. Once youth become involved in the justice system, they experience subpar education, interrupted learning, poor reintegration, and that leads to the cumulative disadvantage and the reinforcing cycle that unfortunately so many youth are trapped in. When we turn our attentions to the consequences of juvenile justice system involvement, we can see that youth incarceration has significant short-term and long-term negative effects. Confinement disrupts education, counseling, and vocational services, often worsening behavior and increasing affiliation and identification with antisocial behavior and delinquent peers. Youths released even after dismissal of charges still face stigma, and many continue to struggle with unresolved issues like low literacy and academic achievement, emotional challenges, and difficulty maintaining employment and relationships. Involvement with the justice system creates additional risks, increasing the likelihood of future offenses and difficulties in education and employment. Youths who are formally processed are also more likely to face rearrest, incarceration, and challenges in suppressing aggression and violence. They also show greater engagement with negative peers and lower school enrollment and graduation rates, as well as a reduced perception of future possibilities and opportunities. With respect to different rates of education, in terms of high school graduation, only 16% of youth detained received a high school graduation, and this drops to only 8% for students who are detained over a month. For students not detained, there is a 72% graduation rate, significantly different. In terms of dropout rates, 57% of youth who are detained drop out, and this increases to 62% for youth detained over a month. For youth who are not detained, there is only a 14% dropout rate. High school dropouts are 3.5 times more likely as well to be arrested. With respect to completing a high school or college, in terms of those who receive their GED, only 16% of students receive their GED while detained. 16% of detained students receive their GED, and only 7% of those students complete the GED while they are incarcerated. So a very low number. In total, 30% of federal prison inmates lack a high school diploma, and that number increases to 35% for Black or Hispanic inmates. With respect to college enrollment, those who are detained enter college at a rate of 37%, and those who go to a four-year college who have been detained is only 2.2%. For those students who are not detained, 51% go on to college enrollment. High school dropouts are 63% more likely to be incarcerated than college graduates. Research found that detained students underperformed on most markers of educational achievement compared to their non-detained peers. Also, students who had more intense involvement with detention, characterized by either a longer exposure or multiple detention episodes, performed at lower academic levels relative to students with less intense involvement with juvenile detention. When we look at additional consequences of juvenile justice system involvement, we can see that there is a 43% recidivism rate for individuals sentenced before age 21, which is the highest among all age groups, leading to an upwards of 41% increased chance of adult incarceration. There is a 60.4% recidivism rate for those without a high school diploma, and a 7% recidivism rate for those with a college degree. So that number drops significantly with additional education, as we can see. There is a 50 to 70% recidivism rate among youthful offenders discharged from secure facilities without the benefit of transition services, such as education. So as we can see, those services from the beginning to the end are so crucial to reduce potential justice system involvement as well as potential recidivism. In a study of more than 4,000 juveniles, youth with above average academic performance during the time they were confined were more likely to return to school upon release and 2 times less likely to recidivate than their lower performing peers. Best practices recommend that juvenile systems prioritize individual services, that they allocate resources effectively, and focus on community-based rehabilitation. Providing quality rehabilitative education with structured, strengths, and evidence-based programming during incarceration is essential to reduce recidivism and support reintegration into schools or higher education. Expanded diversion programs and investments in interventions that address educational, vocational, and mental health needs are also recommended to improve youth, family, and community outcomes. Now we're going to look at criminogenic risk, needs, and responsivity. Risk, needs, responsivity is the leading global model of offender assessment and treatment. Criminogenic needs and risks are those dynamic factors which contribute to offending or reoffending. Studies have shown that a solid educational foundation can positively impact at least 6 of these 8 needs, which can lead youth to juvenile justice system involvement. So as we go around all of these needs, we will identify the risks as well as the way in which education can be a protective factor. The first risk is antisocial cognitions. These are antisocial values, beliefs, or cognitive emotional states of rage, anger, and defiance that might lead a youth to justice system involvement. Education as a protective factor can provide positive reinforcement from teachers and peers, which yields improved self-concept, self-esteem, and pro-social identity. This helps to expand limiting beliefs about future opportunities and encourages positive aspirations and long-term goal setting. Antisocial associates are friends or peers who are engaged in delinquent or criminal activities and behaviors such as gangs. Education as a protective factor provides structured, nurturing educational environments which offer supportive mentoring relationships and continuity of care, as well as safe outlets for positive interactions with achievement-oriented peers. In terms of behavioral characteristics, we saw a lot of that with we will see a lot of that shortly when we talk about the causes for individuals with disabilities and the causes of root causes of behavior. But ultimately, we see impulsive, risky, or defiant behavior, lack of empathy, perspective, or accountability at the root of these risk factors. Education can bring certain learning or neurological differences or challenges that are presented with these antisocial behaviors to the surface and can improve them when the student is properly diagnosed and treated. A recent study conducted by the Council of State Governments Justice Center, University of Massachusetts Chan Medical School, and UC Berkeley's Risk Resilience Lab offered an unprecedented multi-state, multi-year examination of the risk and protective factors that most influence initial juvenile delinquency and violent recidivism. Strikingly, the only common denominator and factor for both initial juvenile delinquency and ongoing violent recidivism was behavioral problems in school. And again, we will explore this further in a moment. In terms of family background risks, family dysfunction, history of criminality, psychological problems, abuse, neglect, or poverty can absolutely contribute to delinquency in youth. Education as a protective factor offers an educational environment in which all stakeholders, parents, guardians, caregivers, caseworkers, or therapists, are involved to provide a continuum of care and supportive network for the youth. This can also help to attenuate the negative repercussions of justice system involvement, such as impaired health and disconnection from family, community, and civic engagement. In terms of education and employment background, academic adversity covers a wide range of reasons why students fall behind and end up with skill gaps and deficiencies. We will explore this more in depth in a moment. Education as a protective factor can bring improved academic and cognitive skills to the student, which lead to better educational and employment prospects and outcomes, as we have seen. This leads to greater income capacity and therefore higher personal opportunity cost for incarceration as well. Academic struggles are closely linked to suspensions, expulsions, truancy, dropping out, and delinquent behaviors. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends early identification and intervention for youths facing school difficulties to reduce their risk of involvement in the juvenile justice system. According to the National Center on Safe, Supportive Learning Environments, schools play a crucial role in fostering protective factors that enhance resilience against all kinds of challenges and adversity. By providing caring relationships, high expectations, and academic standards, and opportunities for participation and contribution, schools can mitigate future problems and support positive development. With respect to the use of leisure or recreation time, a 2022 Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention report indicates that violent crime committed by youth peaks in the after-school hours on school days and is highest at 3 p.m., regardless of gender or race. So across the country, it is at 3 p.m. After school on school days that we know crime spikes. And so therefore, the OJJDP report also states that prevention efforts to reduce offending by youth after school and early evening, such as through educational diversion programs, would have the greatest impact on reducing violent crime. As we can see so far, there is significant benefit to education across the board. Finally, when we look at criminal history, a history of delinquency or criminal behavior obviously indicates the potential for future risk. Education as a protective factor indicates that up to a 43% lower chance of recidivating exists for those who have had educational programming while incarcerated. And this is based on 57 studies over a 37-year period. So the history and the research is there to demonstrate that the educational programming, both as a prevention and a diversion and an incarceration intervention during incarceration, can have significant long-term positive benefits. Every one of these factors, with the arguable exception of substance misuse, can be dramatically improved by having a solid educational foundation built in a positive learning environment, which promotes self-esteem and self-regulation and provides compassionate support as opposed to punishment for challenges students face. Education can give people a voice, open up doors to a better future, and restore individuals' self-esteem and social competence. As Horace Mann once said, education is the great equalizer, but this is only true if it works for the most vulnerable individuals and if they have access to it. Now we are going to explore the role of academic adversity in behavioral issues. Academic adversity refers to challenges, difficulties, or obstacles that students encounter in their educational journey, which hinder their academic progress and achievement. Addressing academic adversity involves identifying these challenges and implementing supportive measures to help students overcome them and succeed in their educational pursuits. Many longitudinal studies indicate that there is a strong bidirectional connection between academic deficiencies and behavior. Research has demonstrated that academic difficulties are predictive of behavior difficulties, including internalization, such as anxiety, depression, or withdrawal, and externalization, such as aggressive or outwardly disruptive behavior. Similarly, students with such challenges are at increased risk for lower academic performance. The Child Mind Institute has identified a variety of primary factors which drive children's behavioral issues, all of which are actually covered under the Individuals with Disability Education Act in some way or another, which we'll explore more in depth in a moment. Most problem behaviors are a way that children adapt to or avoid challenging environments that they cannot manage effectively on their own. One thing that makes a school environment difficult for a student is when they don't feel capable of doing what is expected of them. When a student can't read or isn't able to understand a math problem, they lose their confidence and begin to fail. The student needs to find success somewhere, and so behavior issues arise as the student is recognized or feels power for being the funny or disruptive child. A student would rather miss an assignment or get a detention than turn in failing work. When class and homework become too hard, students don't do it. And when school becomes too hard, students don't go. Think about yourself and your career. If you were put in the position you have today without the skills and abilities to do it well, how would you feel? It's a natural reaction to begin to have low self-confidence and possibly withdraw from tasks or even give up on the job because you can't do it. This is what so many at-risk youth feel every day. The pandemic only magnified this bidirectional relationship. Assessments administered to students across a range of schools, socioeconomic backgrounds, ages, and locations during the 2022-23 school year showed a notable increase in the percentage of students struggling with executive functions and memory. Due to such significant learning loss from the COVID-19 impact to education, more than 70% of teachers report a recent rise in disruptive behavior in the classroom, which is a significant increase from 2019 pre-pandemic levels. Many empirical studies from the brain sciences highlight the detrimental link between chronic stress, executive functioning, and problematic behavior. Nervous system dysregulation is at the root of difficulties with executive functioning, memory, cognitive processing, and the emotional disturbances that lead to unwanted behaviors. Unfortunately, one of the consequences of frequent behavioral issues in the classroom is that students end up losing about 3 weeks of cumulative instructional time as a result. In addition, more than 70% of schools are reporting dramatic increases in absenteeism for both students and staff, making appropriate educational gains very challenging. These issues, of course, are only exacerbated by other at-risk factors, such as limited English proficiency, poverty, or trauma. Educators must address both academic and behavioral challenges holistically, as each domain influences the other in significant ways and can worsen over time. Teachers can reduce issues in both of these areas by providing social emotional support alongside of academic interventions. Early identification and intervention across both areas can mitigate long-term negative outcomes for both youth and their communities. So now we are going to delve into all of the different root causes for academic adversity. And the first we will explore is all of the individuals with disabilities that are covered under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. Going down the list here, we have mental, physical, and behavioral health challenges, cognitive, neurological, and learning differences, developmental delays and differences, neurodivergent difficulties, intellectual or developmental disabilities or delays, hearing, visual, speech, language, and motor orthopedic impairment, traumatic brain injury, other health impairments which limit strength, vitality, alertness, or attentiveness. This includes chronic health issues, as well as specific learning disabilities and emotional disturbances. So on the first column here, under cognitive, neurological learning differences or delays, neurodivergent difficulties, or intellectual disabilities or delays. There are a number of classifications and breakdowns that I will also share with you in these categories. So this includes, especially under the heading of neurodivergence, attention deficit or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, AUDHD, which is a hybrid between autism and ADHD, as well as dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, and dysnomia, which are all disorders of reading, writing, calculation, or speech. Many of these types of delays or developmental differences can include behavior patterns which can be considered antisocial or even criminogenic. Titles such as obsessive compulsive disorder, rejection sensitive dysphoria, pathological demand avoidance, oppositional defiance disorder, or conduct disorder all have a dysregulation of the nervous system at the root, which can lead to antisocial behaviors and uncooperative responses from youth. Impulsivity, hypervigilance, and a heightened sense of neuroception, or an autonomic nervous system threat detection, leads to emotional and nervous system dysregulation and a chronic state of sympathetic activation, fight or flight. This can yield aggressive or externalizing behavior because the youth never feel safe in their own nervous systems as a result of either a cognitive difference or perhaps trauma, which can also dysregulate the nervous system and lead to ongoing and permanent hypervigilance and threat detection. Delayed development of executive functioning and decision-making capacity is often another hallmark of these challenges. So youth are an average of 3 years behind in their executive functioning development. So a youth who's 15 may only be functioning as an 11 or 12-year-old in terms of their cognitive capacity for executive functioning. And this often yields a cognitive and relational disconnect between cause and effect, as well as communication, memory, and processing differences. This can lead to an inability to learn from consequences or past behavior and events, which makes the punishment in the juvenile justice system twice as cruel because the students have an incapacity cognitively to actually learn from the consequences that they are being administered. A specific learning disability is a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. And an emotional disturbance is an inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or other health factors. An inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers, inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under certain circumstances, a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression or mood disorders, and finally, a tendency to even develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. So as we can see, many of these factors will absolutely limit a youth's ability to understand the system, understand the rules, follow the rules, or even learn from their mistakes once punished. And this is all under the classification of individuals with disabilities. And so to punish those with a disability is really problematic because they have the inability to learn from that punishment. When we look at the statistics, they are even more startling. 65 to 70% of youth at any contact point within the justice system, from initial intake through reintegration and reentry, meet the criteria for a disability, a rate that is more than 3 times higher than that of the general population. 85% of all juveniles in the system are functionally illiterate, and over 60% of all prison inmates are functionally illiterate as well. Over 70% can't even read above a 4th grade level. Inmates have a 70% chance of returning to prison if they receive no literacy support, as opposed to only a 16% chance for those who do receive education and literacy. That is a significant difference. And yet, strong literacy programs don't always exist for youth in incarceration, and often they're not getting the services that they need. Students not reading by grade level, on grade level by third grade are 4 times more likely to drop out of high school than proficient readers. And delinquents also demonstrate lower verbal IQs as well as lower school achievement. 33% of inmates who dropped out of high school report academic difficulties as the cause. In its model program guide, Literature Review, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention shares research which demonstrates that compared with non-disabled youths who commit offenses, those with intellectual and developmental disabilities, again, 70% of the system, those with intellectual or developmental disabilities tend to commit more serious offenses, are at a much higher risk of recidivism, and enter the juvenile justice system at a younger age. Youths with disabilities are also more likely to become involved in the child welfare system because of a higher risk of abuse and maltreatment by parents and guardians. In addition, a report from the Bureau of Justice Statistics showed that the rate of violent victimization against persons with disabilities was at least double that of the rate for those without disabilities. So this is a real double whammy that those with disabilities are not only being incarcerated at higher rates, but they're also being themselves victimized at twice the rate. The Department of Justice also acknowledges, quote, the link between academic failure and delinquency, violence and crime is welded to reading failure, end quote. The Coalition for Juvenile Justice created standards of care for youth with undiagnosed or mistreated disabilities, which call for law enforcement and family serving systems to educate, engage, and support families and youth in plans for effective services and interventions. They recommend developing a holistic approach to addressing the child's disability both during and outside of school hours through increased involvement with mentors, coaches, and youth development approaches. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act also recommends that juvenile court intake personnel investigate pre-court efforts to identify and address a child's special education needs and ensure that referring systems provide information on accommodations offered. Before school, mental health, or other social service system professionals refer children with the identified or suspected disabilities to the status offense system, they must assess whether the conduct at issue relates to or is caused by the disability, as justice system involvement will only exacerbate these problems. Now we are looking at the root causes of academic adversity, adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, and trauma. There are many reasons why students face academic adversity and get off track with their education. At least 75% of the youth in the juvenile justice system have experienced some form of traumatic victimization themselves, known as an adverse childhood experience, or ACE. Compared to the general population, youth offenders were found to be 13 times more likely to have at least one ACE and 4 times more likely to be exposed to 4 or more ACEs. Youth with a higher prevalence of ACEs are more likely to become serious, violent, and chronic juvenile offenders. In multiple states, authors have estimated that 25 to 30% of incarcerated youth meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. This again impacts cognition, executive functioning, and many other aspects of behavior. Children within the welfare system are also overrepresented among justice-involved youth. Significant data, including a National Institute of Justice report, indicates that over half of the youth in the justice system have prior engagements with child welfare services. The number of children in foster care has also risen by 8% since 2012. In addition to ACEs, students experience academic adversity due to disadvantages that arise from socioeconomic and geographic factors like family history, substandard educational environments. All of these challenges create skill gaps in a student's educational foundation, which have long-range repercussions. Creating trauma-informed student engagement begins with building capacity in the student emotionally before we do so academically. Students who have had their education derailed often suffer from learned helplessness and limiting core beliefs about themselves and their own potential. Supportive supplemental education can help to limit or reverse the impact of these adversities which they have faced. Now we're going to look at another root cause of academic adversity, which is time that students spend out of school. Students encounter a range of academic adversities and interruptions that can derail their education and increase their likelihood of justice system involvement. These interruptions include the following: school and resident displacement and disruption. Students affected by homelessness, migrancy, juvenile justice, or child welfare involvement are often moved more frequently and experience greater disruption in their educational continuity. With respect to chronic absenteeism and truancy, chronic absenteeism has risen sharply, particularly among students from low-income and minority families. It increased from 15% in 2019 to 30% in 2023, doubling in just a few years post-pandemic. Missing more than 10% of high school days increases the risk of dropout by 7 times. Truancy alone accounts for a 58% share of status offense cases, with these offenses rising post-COVID despite all other sorts of offenses on the decline. And a study of more than 400 incarcerated ninth graders found that in the year prior to detention, these students had attended school barely half the time and were failing most of their courses. Students with a history of truancy and grade retention are particularly vulnerable to becoming trapped in the cycle of academic failure and system involvement. 20% of system-involved youth are detained for failing to meet probation conditions, including good grades and school attendance. Court hearings held during school hours also reduce instructional time, further exacerbating academic disruptions. Students involved with the justice system will actually miss up to an additional 7.5 days of school just by virtue of their involvement, as compared to before they became involved in the justice system. With respect to school exclusion, disciplinary suspension, and expulsion, exclusionary discipline practices, often without proper due process, disproportionately affect students of color, especially Black students, who experience more severe suspensions for similar infractions and at twice the rate. Students with learning disabilities or low academic performance are also more likely to face suspension. Studies of disciplinary expulsion indicated 4 risk factors: poor grade point average and achievement scores, particularly in English and math, habitual truancy and chronic absenteeism, history of previous suspensions, and the eligibility for special education services. So we can see that this creates a vicious cycle where students who struggle in school, who have need for special education services, may experience truancy and absenteeism because they don't feel engaged in school, they don't feel capable of doing what is asked of them, and this gives rise to behavioral problems that yields suspensions and expulsions, which then further reduces the student's capacity academically and only continues this vicious cycle. Schools are often notified of students' justice involvement, often leading to substandard alternative school placements or exclusion altogether from in-person classes and extracurricular activities, even before a youth has been found guilty, again, without appropriate due process. These exclusionary practices increase students' risk of justice system involvement and exacerbate their existing educational difficulties. We also have to deal with time out of school for processing, treatment, and intervention reasons. Youth in detention often lack consistent access to education, with many receiving minimal or no instruction during confinement. According to the OJJDP's Juvenile Residential Facility Census, 20 to 27% of detained youth did not attend classes, rising to 41% for youth in diagnostic centers. 34% of youth in detention facilities that are larger of over 100 residents lacked educational programs, and only 5 to 10% of youth exiting the juvenile justice system return to public school and graduate. Again, the numbers speak for themselves, and they are not good with respect to the outcomes for these youth. There are clearly many causes for the academic adversity which can derail a student's education and erode foundations for future success. When this happens, school and learning can become more of a liability than an asset to a student by further compounding existing trauma and risk factors. Ultimately, however, the cause is not as important as the cure, which is delivering the best education possible and empowering students to reach their fullest potential. Research demonstrates that high-impact tutoring and personalized support can close learning gaps and improve outcomes for students, families, and communities. By nurturing strengths, capacities, and possibilities, we can build a future focused on what can be, not just on what is. Now we're going to explore the racial and ethnic disparities that exist in the system. Students of color face significant disparities in both disability diagnosis and involvement in the justice system, highlighting a pressing equity issue in education. For example, while Black youth comprised only 15% of the juvenile population in 2019, they represented a staggering 35% of the delinquency caseload, with higher rates across nearly all offense categories. This systemic inequity is further reflected in educational outcomes. Only 16% of Black and 29% of Latino fourth graders were reading at a proficient level in 2022, with reading proficiency for special education students on the further decline. Black students are also disproportionately over-identified for special education, particularly in categories such as emotional disturbance and intellectual disability, which increase academic and behavioral risk factors. Let's think of this for a moment. The average age of an incarcerated youth is 16 years old, and the reading statistics show that the average reading level of these youth is fourth grade, then that is a 7-grade level differential below expectation. The opportunity to provide literacy and reading skills is tremendous for these youth, and the opportunity for their improvement is even greater. Additionally, reports of unfair discipline disproportionately affect students of color, with 23% of Black students and 32% of American Indian, Alaskan Native students indicating such disproportionate or unfair experiences in discipline. African American male students with disabilities have the highest suspension rate, sometimes exceeding 70% in major districts. This is also the demographic most represented in the juvenile justice system. And there is a complete connection between those numbers. It is an absolute pipeline. This alarming trend underscores the systemic inequalities faced by students of color with disabilities, who often receive harsher treatment than their peers. Under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, disciplinary measures must balance school safety with appropriate responses to behaviors linked to a child's disability. When disciplinary actions are considered, a manifestation determination is essential to ascertain whether a child's behavior stems from their disability. If so, the child should not face punitive measures without appropriate support, such as a functional behavioral assessment and an intervention plan. This approach is crucial in addressing the unique needs of students with disabilities, ensuring they receive equitable treatment within educational systems. Even under the IDEA, students can lose valuable educational time as a result of disciplinary action. Anywhere between 10 and 45 days of time out of school is allowed by law under the IDEA. That only further exacerbates a student's academic adversity, even in the best of circumstances. These statistics underscore that our educational system is failing to meet the academic needs of overrepresented groups in the justice system. And this failure impairs our ability to restore young people to their communities. If public education is to realize its full capacity to reduce recidivism, it must make rigorous learning and academic remediation a top priority for justice-involved youth. Now we're going to explore the difference between special education and supplemental education. We have now seen how a wide range of learning differences, disabilities, delays, or disruptions can prevent students from acquiring or retaining the skills necessary for appropriate educational advancement. These educational challenges impact the majority of detained or incarcerated youth and legally require special education services. Most of these students qualify for special education, but even when such legally required modifications and accommodations are put in place, they do not address the root deficiencies which prevent students from functioning at the level of their peers. Consider the following analogy of a child who does not know how to swim, but needs to be in the pool with peers. There are three options for support which are not mutually exclusive. Accommodation. Accommodation involves providing a swimmies or a life vest for students to go into the deep end of the pool with their peers and still stay above water if they don't know how to swim. Accommodations adjust how students engage with the material. Modifications involve changing the expectation from being in the deep end to being in the shallow end, which is more accessible based on the student's current capacities. Modifications change what the students are expected to learn. Remediation, in contrast, involves teaching the student how to swim step by step, starting at their identified comfort level and progressing at the student's adaptive pace until mastery is achieved. Remediation involves rectifying the skill gaps causing poor academic performance, which will generally lessen a student's need for accommodations and modifications in the future. Special education in schools predominantly focuses on accommodations and modifications, as those are easier to implement and require less direct teacher and administrative intercession. While these interventions allow students to continue to learn along with the rest of their class, this often means that root problems and deficits are not addressed with remediation and therefore continue to worsen over time. 14% of elementary school students receive special education, but that increases to 26% for middle and high school students, which demonstrates that the core problems are not improving and only worsening because accommodations and modifications are not remediating the core concerns. Supplemental education, also known as high impact or high dosage tutoring, does have the power to provide students with remediation of foundational academic skills from the ground up in a totally customized setting, which is adaptive to each learner's unique development. This individualized approach identifies where the student got off track, meets the youth exactly where they are, and brings them in a safe and comfortable setting to their desired destination. This level of personalization enables the student to feel accomplishment as opposed to frustration or failure for the first time in a long time, or perhaps even ever. The more success a student experiences, the more quickly they move through the program because it's adaptive to their development, which provides them with self-confidence, self-efficacy, agency, and empowerment, and leads to a greater motivation and engagement overall. This is how to shift a failure chain into a success cycle, whereby the student becomes an active, independent learner long after services have been completed. This approach has been endorsed by the National Educational Association as one which has the power to dramatically improve student achievement over any other kind of educational intervention, including increasing the number of teachers in the classroom, decreasing the number of students in the classroom, changing curriculum materials, providing additional other sorts of instructional interventions like STEM or other sorts of interventions. It is exclusively the high dosage tutoring that the NEA has identified as having the greatest impact to close these educational gaps. Recent studies have shown that just 50 hours of personalized supplemental instruction can yield up to 15 months of academic rehabilitation and learning recovery. These gains are even more pronounced for students who are economically disadvantaged, in the racial minority, or otherwise considered at risk. In 2022, a Bellwether Education Partners published a study called Double Punished, Locked Out of Opportunity. Its authors identified the huge opportunity in facilities for skill gap remediation. Haley T.N. Corman, author, states, "When I spend time in facilities, one of the questions I ask is, when was the last time you remember going to school every day? The answer I usually get is something like 5th or 6th grade. So kids usually have intensive skill gaps, especially around literacy." At Huntington, we've recently spoken with nonprofit organizations that are justice and youth serving. And in our recent conversation, we were discussing the 11-year-olds that they had in their care who had not been to school in several years. So this is not something that is going on in small pockets. This is something that is going on pervasively and problematically across the system. With respect to exploring other differences between special and supplemental education, when we look at the time frame for offering an individualized evaluation, special education laws indicate a 60 to 90-day time frame to administer an evaluation and to meet to review services that could then be introduced or applied within another 30 days. So we could be looking at upwards of 3 to 4 months before any services are offered in practice. With supplemental education, a full, thorough, multiple test initial individual evaluation is administered immediately upon the family or facility request, with results available immediately and the ability to implement the new educational supports and services able to be administered as quickly as potentially the next day. So there's not a significant delay for youth in acquiring special or supplemental education versus there is a delay in acquiring supplemental education. When we look at the frequency of progress reporting in special education, reports are provided on the typical report card period. And in supplemental education, we are reporting to families, caregivers, other stakeholders educationally on a monthly basis or as often as necessary. And we offer a full monthly in-person or online meeting to review all progress, all student feedback, all teacher feedback, and all scores and results so that there is a frequent adjustment to the program relative to the progress the student is experiencing. This is also indicative in our formal reevaluation that we conduct every 2 to 3 months in supplemental education to ensure the student is maintaining their appropriate track. With special education, a formal reevaluation is only conducted every 1 to 3 years. So as you might imagine, much can change in that time that isn't being addressed. And so, again, we make the program changes regularly with supplemental education based on day-to-day student needs and day-to-day adaptive progress, whereas in special education, changes are only made generally during an annual review based on teacher reports and observations. Finally, with respect to the educational methodology that we've just discussed, the schools in special education provide accommodations or modifications to adjust what or how the students learn based on their limitations. With supplemental education, we provide remediation of core skills from the comfort level to grade level, rebuilding academic foundations from the ground up, thereby reducing the number of limitations that the students need to contend with and experience. These are not mutually exclusive. They work best together, but often students are only getting special education and never getting the supplemental or remedial education, which will really help improve their academics, close the gaps of their adversity, and improve long-term outcomes. Now we're going to take a look at the OJJDP, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, Continuum of Care for Communities. This model specifically outlines a broad array of youth justice programs and services, ranging from prevention programs for young children and youth who are at risk of delinquency to intervention programs serving high-risk youth in secure residential settings, as well as reentry programs for youth who are returning to their communities. This framework has been shown to improve youth outcomes and reduce reoffending. In an effective continuum of care, the majority of youth would be served through prevention and early or low intervention services. That is a direct quote. In this continuum, education, however, is only explicitly listed at the last stage during community reintegration, but would serve as an effective measure along all points of the spectrum of interventions. Quote, this approach has been proven to be cost-effective. According to research from the Justice Policy Institute, the average state cost for secure confinement is $588 a day, or $214,620 a year, while community programs can cost as little as $75 a day, or $27,375 a year. In addition, diverting youth away from long-term involvement in the justice system can result in much higher long-term economic and societal outcomes, societal benefits for everyone. According to a study published in the American Economic Review entitled The Effects of Education on Crime, Evidence from Prison Inmates, Arrest and Self-Reports, having a foundational education and high school degree significantly reduces criminal activity. Consequently, education has an even larger social return to the community than it does for the individual inmate. In this 2004 study, they determined that a mere 1% increase in the high school completion rate of males alone would save the U.S. a conservative minimum of $1.4 billion a year in reduced costs from crime incurred. In today's dollars, that would equal over $2.3 billion in savings. This study goes as far as to determine that while increasing the police force is a cost-effective policy for reducing crime, increasing high school graduation rates offers a far greater benefit when both crime reductions and economic and social productivity increases are considered. This is a win-win for all involved, and this is true for all services which support youth at risk. Early educational intervention with supplemental tutoring can help to prevent the loss of student skills, confidence, and motivation, ensuring stronger academic foundations for better long-term youth, family, and even community outcomes. In 2014, the United States Department of Education and the United States Department of Justice partnered to recommend guiding principles for providing a high-quality education in juvenile justice secure care settings. In 2015, the Council of State Governments Justice Center also issued similar best practices for correctional programming. And in 2022, National Partnership for Juvenile Services published its domains for a high-quality juvenile justice education system. When viewed together, these recommendations outline a comprehensive approach to improving education in juvenile justice facilities, emphasizing alignment with community standards, student well-being, and smooth transitions back into society. So when we look at educational quality and accountability, the goals are to ensure access to same educational and vocational services as the broader community, and to align juvenile justice programs with state standards and obtain national accreditation. The goal is also to allocate sufficient funding to meet community-level educational standards. With respect to curriculum and instruction, the goal is to use rigorous, individualized curricula aligned with state standards and appropriate for the unique needs of each student. The goal is to incorporate special and remedial education services as needed, and to collect data and track academic progress and participation in order to make data-driven decisions. Also, the goal is to use technology safely and effectively to enhance learning and to prepare students for college, careers, and long-term independent living. With respect to supportive environments, the goal is to recruit and train qualified teachers with relevant skills for justice-involved youth, to maintain appropriate student-teacher ratios for personalized support, to create a safe, consistent, and predictable environment that promotes trust and learning and supports the whole child needs of all learners, and uses positive behavioral interventions and restorative justice practices. Finally, the social emotional development and transitions require that schools support students with social emotional learning aligned with CASEL's framework on social emotional education. To ensure the continuity of care by building stable relationships with educators, and to facilitate a smooth reentry into communities through collaboration with families and youth-based organizations. High-quality educational support for at-risk youth serves as a powerful protective mechanism against delinquency, as well as a critical component of rehabilitation for those already involved. Ultimately, at whatever stage along the continuum of care, proactively serving the educational needs of youth not only provides these individuals with the foundations necessary for a successful future, but also yields significant economic and societal benefits as well. And Huntington is quite proud to be able to state that our programs and services are absolutely in alignment with all of these characteristics of a high-quality juvenile justice education, from the educational quality and accountability, our curriculum, our national accreditation, our individualization to youth, our supportive and positive environments, our work with teachers and other parents and guardians involved with the youth, and ultimately supporting their emotional and social education as well by helping to improve their confidence, motivation, self-efficacy, and empowerment. All of these things are exactly what are called for in juvenile justice education. So we again are proud to be in alignment with the missions of juvenile justice field. In our closing considerations, we would like to share a letter from Randall Farmer of the National Partnership of Juvenile Services. He is the director of the chair of the Educational Committee, and he shared this with Huntington on August 20th, 2024. I had a thought the other night. Everybody talks about the damage and destructiveness of juvenile justice youth and how dangerous juvenile justice youth are to our communities. But in reality, they have collectively lived through more damage, lived through more destruction and more danger in their own lives than they ever commit themselves. The sum total of what they actually do or commit doesn't even come close to equaling what they have had to live through in their own lives. The scales of suffering, pain, injustice, destruction, and injury are heavily weighted more against themselves than it ever is against the community. When you look at the totality of the juvenile justice involved life's experience, the harm done to them typically far outweighs the damage they do to others. Yet what we hear predominantly discussed is the damage or danger to society. The majority of pain and suffering isn't on society. It is actually occurring in the lives of the youth. Yet that is not the significant focus of society's concern. We need to flip that script in the way that we talk about juvenile justice youth and the juvenile justice issues. The damage done to youth throughout their lives should be the dominant focus in every discussion related to policy or funding or responses to youth or even changing our language use. We need to flip the script to fit this reality. Youth are accountable for their actions, but their accountability comes from events that have happened in their lives. The acts they commit have come from the acts that have been committed upon them from birth. How we direct that is the function of juvenile justice. This does not dismiss their accountability or their potential danger to the community, but it does take the focus of that danger off of them and place it upon their history, which provides for hope and reform. It acknowledges the longer history of damage to them rather than the shorter-term damage they have done to society. This focuses the weight of the issue on their history, thus creating a different perspective and an avenue of hope for the youth. So based on this, my dream is to take the approach we've used with failure change students for nearly 50 years with great success and expand that to juvenile justice. I have great confidence that we can make the same positive impacts with justice-affected youth by giving them a solid educational foundation on which to build their future. My ultimate dream would be to have this success roll outward into the entire educational system, because it's clear that the one-size-fits-all model is not working, and it's time for a change toward a more personalized approach. Ultimately, Huntington deeply supports the juvenile justice mission of rehabilitation through individualized interventions, and we hope that together in partnership, we can continue to improve outcomes for youth, their families, and communities alike. In service of Huntington's goal to provide quality education to at-risk students, we have created a number of national partnerships with organizations that support youth impacted by juvenile justice, welfare, foster care, homelessness, and migration. We have also established partnerships with organizations and experts in the field of learning disabilities, neurodivergence, and college admissions. In these national relationships, along with those we make at the local and agency levels, enable us to be a knowledgeable resource in the field of publicly funded supplemental educational services. We are partners with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, the National Partnership for Juvenile Services, who's hosting this webinar, the Council of Juvenile Justice Administrators, the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, the Association of Residential and Children's Residential and Community Services, Learning Disabilities Association of America, as well as the Elementary and Education Act National Network of State Program Administrators, Middle States Association, and expert field partnerships such as Mary Rooney with ADHD and special education and neurodivergence, and author Jeff Salingo in the field of college admissions. We thank you for your efforts and for your time spent here with us today. Again, my name is Sarah Ahrens, and I'm a partnership specialist. The director of our department is Kristen Dench, and you are welcome to scan the code to learn more about our programs or to email us at publiclyfundedprograms@hlcmail.com or give us a call at 888-349-9130. I also want to note for you here that all of the resources and references for this webinar are listed in the last pages of the PowerPoint, which is available as well. Thank you so much for your time and your attention, and we look forward to supporting you in your work with juvenile justice and at-risk youth, because together we can help to give every student the best education possible. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.